This was not a hierarchy of holiness. It was a threat classification system, and someone edited the warning labels off it a very long time ago. So ask yourself this: why does nearly every angel recorded in the Hebrew Bible open its mouth with the same 4 words before it says anything else about who sent it or why? Not a greeting, not a name, a command. Stay with me, because today we take this entire structure apart, rank by rank, and rebuild it the way the source texts actually describe it, in obsessive detail, with the warning labels put back on. By the river Chebar, in the land of the Babylonian exile, a priest named Ezekiel goes down on his face in the mud. The sky over the water has split open. That is the word he reaches for, split, not opened, not parted. Wind comes out of the north first, a storm wind, dragging a fire that folds in on itself instead of rising. Then he sees it. 4 living creatures, and beside each one, a wheel. Not resting near the creature, fused into it, wheel within wheel, turning in 4 directions without ever having to turn at all. The rims are the part that breaks him. He writes that the rims are full of eyes all the way around, and he does not soften the image, does not call it a metaphor, does not call it beautiful. He calls it a chaya, a living thing, a machine that breathes. He will spend the rest of his life failing to describe it properly, and honestly, scholars are still arguing over what he actually meant by half these words. That failure is not a flaw in the text. Hold on to that. It is the first clue. Before we go further, the ground rule, the one we repeat every time so nobody mistakes this for doctrine. Everything in this video is drawn from scripture, mythology, and esoteric tradition, not from established science. I'm not making metaphysical claims, and I'm not asking you to believe any of it literally. What I am asking is that you take the texts seriously as texts, because taken seriously, they say something far stranger than what ended up on the greeting cards. Here is the part that almost nobody seems to want to discuss honestly. Somewhere between the original terror in these accounts and the version most of us grew up with, the fear got edited out. What survived is a picture of angels as gentle, luminous, humanoid comfort, a chorus of soft light standing behind soft news. What the actual manuscripts describe is closer to a containment breach. A being shows up. A human's nervous system registers it. The being's very first act, before it delivers any message at all, is damage control. That is not a hierarchy of holiness we inherited. It is a threat board, and somewhere along the transmission line, through translation, through art, through a few centuries of quietly toning things down, somebody stripped the danger ratings off each entry and left only the pretty description. The traditional schema everyone reaches for, 9 ranks, 3 spheres, angels at the top and the human world at the bottom, comes from a 6th century writer known to history as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. His work, The Celestial Hierarchy, is the reason your mental image of angel ranks exists at all. Almost every chart floating around online is copied from his structure, and almost every one of those charts gets the danger order backward. They treat the lowest rank as the least significant, and the highest rank as the friendliest, the most enthroned, the most stained glass. The texts do not support that reading, not even slightly. Run the actual source material, Ezekiel, the Book of Enoch, the Testament of Solomon, Isaiah, Dionysius himself, and a different pattern surfaces. The ranks scale by proximity to something the human mind was never built to process directly. The lower ranks look almost human because they have to. The higher ranks stop pretending. And the deeper you go into that hierarchy, the more the text stops describing comfort and starts describing containment. Wings that cover faces, wheels that never blink. A structure built less like a choir and more like a series of blast doors, each one absorbing a little more of something the one behind it cannot survive unshielded. This needs to sit for a moment. We're going to walk all 9 ranks from the bottom up in the order the danger actually escalates, not the order tradition prefers. We will look at what each rank is recorded doing to the people who meet it, what protects those people, and what the price of that protection turns out to be. By the end, you will understand why the safest being on this list is not the one that looks the most like us, and why the most dangerous one almost never has to say a word. Long before any of that, though, somebody already knew the danger was real and left a record of exactly how far he was willing to go to avoid drawing it. In the north of France, in a scriptorium lit by nothing but tallow and a narrow window, a monk sits with a half-finished manuscript in the year 1340. His task, assigned by an abbot who wants a complete illustrated Bible for the monastery library, is to copy and illuminate the first chapter of Ezekiel. He has already painted the storm cloud. He has already gilded the fire folding in on itself. His brush is loaded, his pigment ground and mixed, his hand steady enough for the fine line work the wheel's rim will need. He does not paint the eyes. The surviving page, and pages like it survive in more than one collection from this period, shows the wheel's body in careful, confident detail, and then a blank oval where the face of the creature inside it should sit. No sketch line underneath, no erased attempt, just untouched vellum, waiting for a hand that never came back to it. We do not have his reasoning in his own words. What we have is the gap itself, and the gaps like it, repeating across manuscripts, copied by different hands in different decades in different scriptoria that had no contact with one another. Maybe it was reverence. Maybe it was the kind of fear you don't write down because writing it down makes it real. Either way, a man trained his entire life to render sacred images looked at 4 words on a page, a wheel full of eyes, and chose an empty space over a finished one. You have almost certainly felt a version of that same impulse, not about a wheel, about a photograph you didn't open, a message you left unread for 3 days because some part of you already knew what it would say, a hallway light you didn't turn off because turning it off meant crossing the dark part of the room first. The instinct to leave the blank space is old. It did not start with us, and judging by that scriptorium, it did not start anywhere close to us either. That instinct is exactly the mechanism we are tracking for the rest of this video. Because here is the through line running underneath every single encounter we are about to walk through, from the lowest ranked messenger to the 6-winged thing that will not let you see even its own feet. In text after text, language after language, the being that shows up does not open with its name. It does not open with its mission. It opens with the same containment phrase over and over, translated a dozen different ways, but always doing the same job. Do not be afraid. We have been told for centuries that this is comfort, a kindness offered to a frightened human by a gentle messenger. Hold that assumption loosely. Because once you start reading these encounters in the order they actually escalate, not the order the greeting cards prefer, that phrase stops sounding like comfort at all. It starts sounding like a protocol. Every hierarchy needs a floor before it can have a ceiling. So let's build the floor first, because almost nobody starts here, and that is exactly why the whole structure gets misread. Tradition, mainly through Pseudo-Dionysius, but echoed independently in rabbinic commentary and later Christian scholastic writing, organizes the angelic ranks into three spheres. The lowest sphere, closest to human affairs, handles messages, guidance, and physical protection. The middle sphere governs cosmic order, nations, and celestial mechanics. The highest sphere sits closest to the source itself, and the texts get noticeably less coherent the further into that top sphere you push, almost as if the language itself starts to strain. We are walking these 9 ranks from the ground up, danger increasing as we climb, and the ground floor belongs to the Malakim. Malakim is the Hebrew term usually just translated as angel, and that translation flattens something important. The word literally means messenger, the same root used for human envoys, court couriers, and diplomatic runners. In Genesis, in Judges, in Exodus, this is the angel that shows up to deliver one specific piece of information and then leaves. It tells Hagar where to find water in the wilderness. It stops a hand mid-motion at an altar in the binding of Isaac. It appears to Gideon's parents to announce a birth, then vanishes into the flame of an altar fire the moment its message lands. Functionally, this rank carries almost no independent authority. It does not negotiate, it does not improvise. It delivers, confirms, and exits. That is the baseline. Whatever comes next on this list, however the danger escalates, it escalates from this: a courier whose main threat to a human being is the shock of arrival itself, not the being's nature. Even here, though, notice something. The Malakim in Judges chapter 6 sits under a tree while a man named Gideon roasts meat for it as an offering. The angel touches the food once with the tip of its staff. Fire erupts from the rock beneath it and consumes the offering whole, and only then does the messenger disappear. A courier that can ignite stone with a gesture is still, on this scale, the safest thing on the list. Sit with that for a second, because it is going to matter every single time we move up a rank from here. If you are finding this recalibration as unsettling as I did the first time I actually sat down and cross-referenced these texts, instead of trusting the summary version, take the half-second right now to like this video and turn on notifications, so the next descent finds you when it drops, because we are only one rank up, and the floor is already higher than most people assume. One step above the Malakim sits the Archangels, and this is where the record changes in kind, not just in degree. 7 named figures dominate this rank across the Enochian and later apocryphal literature: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and several others whose names shift slightly depending on which manuscript tradition you're reading. What separates this rank from the Malakim below it is not prestige, it's function. The Archangels are the first rank in the record with a documented combat role. The Book of Enoch, specifically the section scholars label the Book of the Watchers, likely composed sometime in the 3rd century before the Common Era, though it draws on older oral material, describes a war council. 4 archangels look down from the heights and observe corruption spreading across the earth, the direct result of a rebellion among lower celestial beings we will get to shortly. The archangels do not simply report what they see upward and wait for instruction. They petition. They advocate for judgment. Then they execute it. Raphael is given the specific task of binding the fallen watcher Azazel, hand and foot, and casting him into darkness in a location the text names as Dudael, sealing him beneath jagged rocks until a final judgment arrives. Michael is assigned the destruction of the corrupted offspring these rebellious beings produced, described in the text as a war fought on the ground, not a metaphor for one. This is worth sitting with.
the rank most people associate with gentle guardianship. Michael standing serene with a sword lowered, Gabriel blowing a horn on a Christmas card, is, in its oldest textual form, a rank defined by military command and forcible restraint. These are not messengers who deliver bad news and leave. These are the beings assigned when a message has already failed and something has to be physically stopped. Here is the interpretation worth pausing on.
Read the promotion logic across just these two ranks and a pattern starts to surface that will hold for the rest of the hierarchy. Danger does not correlate with how far a being sits from human affairs. It correlates with how much independent force that being is authorized to use without waiting for further instruction. The Malakim delivers and departs. The Archangels judge and act. Every rank above this one will grant more of that authority, not less, and the beings will look correspondingly less like something you'd recognize on a greeting card, and more like something built to be looked away from. There's a second thread worth naming here too, one that the Enoch material makes explicit, but that popular retellings tend to quietly drop. The Archangel's war is not against outside enemies. It's against other angels. Watchers, a rank we have not reached yet, who abandoned their assigned function and crossed a line the text treats as catastrophic, not romantic, whatever later folklore did with the story. The beings tasked with cleaning up that mess are the same rank many of us were taught to think of as the friendliest one on the list. Command and containment, not comfort, from the very first rank capable of either. And that word, contain, is going to keep resurfacing as we climb, because it connects directly back to something we still have not answered from the opening of this video. That wheel Ezekiel saw by the river Chebar, the one with rims full of eyes, sits several ranks above where we are right now, and scholars, rabbis, and mystics across 2,500 years of commentary have never fully agreed on what those eyes are actually for. Some readings treat them as pure surveillance, a being that misses nothing.
Other, older, and considerably stranger interpretations treat the eyes as something closer to a containment mechanism, a structure built specifically to hold something in, not to look something out. We are going to reach that wheel again, and when we do, the answer is going to reframe almost everything we just covered about the ranks below it. But 3 ranks up from where we're standing right now, there's a being that the manuscripts describe crawling on the ground. A wheel-eyed, animal-faced thing with no clear front or back. And the fear response it triggers in the humans who recorded meeting it is on a completely different order than anything a messenger or a war commander ever produced. Quick recap before we climb any further. 2 ranks down at the bottom of this ladder, the Malakim, couriers who deliver a message and vanish, and the Archangels, 7 named commanders capable of binding rebellious beings and waging war on the ground. Simple enough logic so far. The higher you climb, the more force gets authorized. But here's the part nobody in 2,500 years of commentary has managed to fully explain. Every rank above these 2 doesn't just gain more authority. It gets more frightening to actually stand in front of. Not more radiant, not more comforting, more frightening. And that reversal, comfort decreasing as holiness increases, is the loop we are opening right now, because it runs all the way to the top of this hierarchy, and it does not resolve the way you'd expect. Climb 1 rank and you reach the Principalities, and this is where the hierarchy stops being personal and starts being political. The clearest reference comes from the Apostle Paul, writing in his letter to the church at Ephesus, where he describes the Christians' real struggle as being not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers,
against the rulers of the darkness of this world. The Greek term is archai, literally origins or rulers, the same root that gives us words like monarchy. Later pseudepigraphal material, particularly texts building on the Enochian tradition and Jewish apocalyptic writing from roughly the same window as the Dead Sea Scrolls, fills in what Paul leaves implicit. Principalities are assigned to nations. Each territory, each kingdom, each people group sits under a specific principality's jurisdiction, a celestial governor with authority scoped to one patch of the map and near total discretion within it. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes something most casual readers skim past. In the Book of Daniel, an angel delayed in reaching the prophet explains the holdup by naming an opponent, the prince of the kingdom of Persia, who withstood him for 3 full weeks until reinforcement arrived. Not a demon in the folk sense, a rival celestial governor, defending territory, strong enough to physically delay a message from getting through for the better part of a month. Read that passage plainly, and the hierarchy stops looking like a single chain of command running top to bottom. It starts looking like competing jurisdictions, actively contesting borders, with human history caught in the actual friction between them. One rank up sit the powers, sometimes rendered virtues depending on the translation lineage you're following, and their job description shifts again. Where principalities govern territory, powers enforce law. Not human law, but the underlying operating rules of the physical and cosmic order. Later mystical commentary, including strands of Jewish Merkaba literature, focused specifically on interpreting Ezekiel's vision, assigns this rank responsibility for maintaining consistency in nature itself. Gravity holding, seasons turning on schedule, the boundary between what is permitted to cross between realms and what is not. When that boundary gets violated, and the Book of Enoch is explicit that it has been more than once, the powers are the rank tasked with restoring it, by force if the text calls for force. Here's the pattern crystallizing now, and it's worth saying plainly. Malakim deliver information. Archangels execute judgment against individuals. Principalities govern territory. Powers enforce the laws underneath reality itself. Each rank isn't just stronger than the one below it. Each rank operates one level further from anything a single human life could ever meaningfully negotiate with. A courier you can at least imagine reasoning with. A cosmic law enforcement mechanism does not reason. It corrects. And that is exactly the kind of correction a group of working men experienced on a hillside outside a small town roughly 2,000 years ago, in an encounter the greeting card industry has spent centuries quietly rewriting. Every nativity scene renders it the same way. A warm glow, a chorus of gentle voices, shepherds gazing up in soft focus wonder. The actual text describes something considerably closer to a group of adults dropping to the ground in genuine physical terror. The Gospel of Luke places the scene outside Bethlehem, shepherds keeping watch over their flock through the night, doing the most unremarkable job available in the ancient world. Then, the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and a single messenger appears. The text's own word for their reaction is not wonder. It is phobos, fear, the same root that gives us the word phobia, and it specifies they were sore afraid, an old translator's way of saying terrified past the point of composure. The very first words out of the angel's mouth, before any news of a birth, before any of it, are the same 4 words we've been tracking since the start of this video. Do not be afraid. Strip away every ornament centuries of art and carols have layered on top of this scene, and what's left is a small group of night shift laborers, alone on a dark hillside, confronted without warning by a being whose mere arrival drops them to the ground before it has said a single sentence of actual content. That is not a scene about tidings of comfort and joy. That is a scene about a species-level nervous system encountering something it has no framework for. And the joy, the actual message, only becomes possible once the fear gets named and addressed first.
You already know this feeling, even if nothing in your life has ever come close to that hillside. The phone ringing at 3 in the morning before you've heard a single word and your whole body already bracing. The moment a doctor's expression changes before they've said anything at all, and you feel the floor shift under a sentence that hasn't been spoken yet. Terror, in both cases, arrives before information does. The body reads the presence of the thing long before the mind gets to process what it's actually saying. That gap between a presence announcing itself and the meaning of that presence finally landing is exactly where those shepherds lived for however many seconds it took the angel to speak its next line. And it is exactly the same gap that swallowed Ezekiel whole beside the river Kebar in the vision we opened this video with. Because here, finally, is an answer to the question we left hanging back in that scene. What the wheels the prophet describes were actually built to do. Later Jewish mystical tradition, particularly the Merkabah commentators who spent centuries obsessively parsing this exact chapter, reads the wheel's function plainly from the text itself. Merkabah is the Hebrew word for chariot, and that is precisely their job. The wheels are not surveillance devices, they are not decoration. Ezekiel states directly that the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels, and that wherever the spirit moved, the wheels moved with it, rising when the creatures rose. Their function is load-bearing. They carry the throne itself. That answer should feel satisfying. It is not the whole answer. Because if the wheels are what carries the throne, that raises an obvious follow-up nobody in this tradition likes to sit with for very long. What, exactly, is riding on top of it? And what would happen to a human being unlucky enough to look directly at the thing being carried? We're not there yet. 2 ranks stand between where we are right now and that answer, and the next one crawls on the ground on 4 faces at once. But what it's actually guarding is the strangest part of this entire hierarchy. 1 rank up from where we left off sits the dominions, and the record here gets thin fast, which is itself worth noting. The higher this hierarchy climbs, the less concrete detail any tradition manages to pin down. Colossians, another of Paul's letters, lists dominions among the ranks in heaven and in earth, visible and invisible, created through and for a singular authority, but gives almost no operational detail beyond that. Pseudo-Dionysius fills the gap by assigning them an administrative function. They take the will of the higher orders above them and translate it into instruction the ranks below can actually carry out. Not couriers, not enforcers, something closer to a relay station, converting intention into command. That word, relay, matters more than it sounds like it should, because it points at something structural running underneath this entire hierarchy that we are finally ready to name directly. Picture the actual machinery that word relay is borrowed from, because Pseudo-Dionysius did not choose it at random. In the royal courts of the ancient Near East, Assyria, Persia, later Rome, a decree issued by a king did not travel to a border village in the king's own voice. It moved through relay. A chancellor drafted the wording, a courier carried the sealed tablet or scroll along a fixed road, and at each staging post a fresh rider took the packet onward, never altering a syllable, never adding personal commentary.
because the seal pressed into the wax was the only proof the message underneath it was genuine. The historian Herodotus describes the Persian system running couriers day and night in relay along the royal road, faster, he claims, than any single rider could manage alone. The villager standing at the gate when a dust-covered stranger arrives with a sealed tablet is not meeting the king. He is meeting the last link in a chain of authority that started somewhere he will never see, in a throne room he will never enter. And every rider in that chain understood exactly one thing: deliver the content unchanged and get out of the way. That is the administrative function dominions are assigned in the celestial version of the same system, not authorship, transmission.
Which means by the time any instruction reaches a rank low enough to actually stand in front of a human being, that instruction has already passed through however many hands and however many ranks sit above it. Go back through every encounter we've covered so far. The Malakim appearing to Hagar in the wilderness, the Archangel Gabriel appearing centuries later, the messenger dropping a group of shepherds to their knees on a hillside outside Bethlehem. Different ranks, different centuries, different authors working in different languages, decades and sometimes centuries apart, with no evidence any of them read each other's material. And yet, every single one of these encounters opens with the identical formula. In the original Hebrew, the phrase is al-tira, 2 words: do not fear. It shows up when an angel meets Hagar in Genesis. It shows up when Gideon panics after realizing what he's just spoken to in Judges. It shows up in Daniel, in Zechariah, and in Greek translation as mephobu, across the entire angelic corpus of the New Testament, word for word, encounter after encounter, author after author, with no coordination between any of them that any historian has ever been able to establish. Here's the reframe I want you to actually sit with, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. We have been taught to read al-tira as spontaneous kindness, a gentle being noticing a frightened human and offering comfort out of compassion, the same way you'd calm a startled child. But look at the pattern again, stripped of that assumption. A fixed 2-word phrase, delivered first, before any other content, in nearly every recorded instance, across multiple independent source traditions over a span of centuries. That is not the profile of spontaneous kindness. That is the profile of a first response protocol. A line issued because the being on the other side of the encounter already knows, as a matter of established fact, that its arrival alone is going to produce a measurable physiological terror response in the humans standing in front of it. And the line exists specifically to manage that response before anything else can happen. Read it that way, and the entire hierarchy reorganizes itself in your head. Al-tira isn't comfort offered by a gentle visitor. It's damage control, issued by something that knows exactly what its own presence does to a human nervous system, and has a standard opening line prepared for it every single time. That is the money shot of this whole video, and it deserves a second the way it needs it, because generations of readers, translators, and preachers took the softest possible reading of the gentlest possible phrase in this entire literature and used it to sand down every hard edge in the text surrounding it. There's a scene worth picturing here too, because it shows exactly how slowly this reframe was available to anyone paying close enough attention. In a study in medieval Troy, in what is now northern France, the 11th century rabbi and commentator Rashi sits with a set of Hebrew manuscripts spread across a low table, working through Genesis line by line for the commentary that would eventually shape how generations of readers understood this text.
He reaches tira in the Hagar narrative, and he does what he does everywhere in his work. He cross-references. He is not treating the phrase as a one-off. He is already noticing, centuries before any modern concordance existed to make the pattern easy to spot, that this exact wording recurs, that it clusters specifically around encounters with celestial messengers, that it never shows up as random comfort in an unrelated sentence.
He has no printing press, no searchable database, nothing but memory, a quill, and years spent inside these texts, and he still catches the pattern by hand. What he does not do, what almost nobody in his tradition or any other did for another 9 centuries after him, is ask the harder question, sitting right underneath the one he'd already found. Not why does this phrase appear so often? Why does it need to? That question sat untouched in the margins of a candlelit study for the better part of a millennium before anyone was willing to follow it all the way down. Which brings us to something that happens constantly, far outside any scripture, in rooms that have nothing to do with angels at all. Picture a hospital corridor, fluorescent light, a family gathered outside a recovery room. A nurse steps out, and before delivering any actual information, she opens with the same 4 words hospital staff are trained to lead with in exactly this situation.
I need you to stay calm.
Say it out loud, and it sounds like reassurance. It is not reassurance. It is a script, taught in training modules, deployed specifically because staff already know, from documented experience, what happens to a room full of people the instant certain news lands unprepared. The calm is not being offered to you. It is being installed in you, on a schedule, by someone managing an outcome. Most of us have lived a version of this moment and mistaken it in the instant for kindness. The manager who opens a meeting with, "Don't worry, this isn't bad news," and the fact that they felt the need to say it at all is the actual information. The friend who texts, "Everything's fine, call me when you can," at 11 at night. In every one of these cases, the soothing phrase arrives first, specifically because the deliverer already knows the update behind it is going to spike your fear. And the phrase exists to blunt that spike before the content even lands. We call it comfort because it's wrapped in comforting language. What it actually is, every time, is crowd control for one. That is the injustice sitting quietly underneath 2,000 years of scripture reading. Not that the beings in these texts were cruel, the opposite, honestly. They appear to have understood exactly how much fear their presence would cause and built a standard response to manage it responsibly. The injustice is what happened afterward, in translation, in art, in 1,000 years of retelling that stripped the protocol context out entirely and left only the soft word, until "fear not" became a bedtime story phrase instead of what it actually was on the page, an emergency line, delivered by something that needed you steady enough to survive hearing the rest of what it came to say. Once you see tira as a protocol rather than a kindness, a harder question opens underneath it, and it's the one driving the rest of this hierarchy from here to the top. A protocol implies a protocol designer. Somewhere, something built this response, standardized it, and issued it across every rank we've covered so far as a mandatory opening line for contact with human beings. That means somewhere above even the ranks we've just walked through, there is an authority that looked at the beings it commands and decided every one of them needed a scripted line to keep humans from breaking on contact. What does that tell you about the beings the protocol was designed to soften people up for?
Because 2 ranks above where we're standing right now, the descriptions stop looking anything like a messenger at all, and the fear response in the record stops being something a 2-word phrase can manage. 2 ranks up from where we left the dominions, We finally reach the wheel-eyed thing crawling on the ground that this video opened with. And it turns out, once you follow the manuscript trail carefully, that crawling undersells it. This is the thrones. And in the older textual tradition, it has a proper name of its own. Ophanim, the wheels. Ezekiel gave us the first version of this back in his opening chapter, but he was not done with it. 9 chapters later, in a second vision recorded years afterward in the same book, he returns to the same throne chariot, and this time gives us considerably more mechanical detail than he offered the first time around.
In Ezekiel chapter 10, the wheels are now explicitly paired with the cherubim rather than described as loosely attached beside them. And the prophet adds a detail he apparently could not fit into words the first time. Their whole body, and their backs, and their hands, and their wings, and the wheels were full of eyes round about. Not the rims this time, everything. Body, hands, wings, wheel, all of it covered. This is not a writer softening his account with a second draft. It is a witness circling back to correct the record because the first attempt did not capture enough. That alone should tell you something about how this rank actually registered on the person who saw it. The Book of Enoch, composed across several centuries by multiple authors and later assembled into the text scholars now treat as a composite work, gives this rank its formal designation and its formal job. It describes them as beings who sleep not, stationed in permanent, unbroken watch around the throne of glory itself, the innermost guard position in the entire structure. Not a rank that visits Earth on assignment, like the Malakim or the Archangels. A rank that never leaves its post, because the thing it is stationed around apparently cannot be left unwatched for even a moment. And that, finally, answers the question this video opened 3 ranks ago. What a protocol designer sophisticated enough to issue a standardized fear management line to every messenger rank being would actually be protecting people from. The Ophanim are the answer. A permanent, unsleeping, fully sensory containment ring, stationed at the one position in the hierarchy where nothing is allowed to go unmonitored for even an instant. Every rank below this one, all the way down to the courier who told Hagar where to find water, exists at some distance from this position. The protocol exists because the distance is doing protective work, and the Ophanim are what's actually being kept at bay by that distance. Here's where I want to push past the usual reading, because most retellings of this vision treat the eyes as a purely symbolic flourish, omniscience, watchfulness, the divine seeing everything, wrapped in poetic language. Read the text as a description rather than a metaphor, the way Ezekiel himself insists on reading it, and a different picture assembles itself. He does not write as if covered in eyes. He writes that they were covered in eyes, full stop. The same flat declarative register he uses to describe the wings and the 4 faces. Later Jewish mystical tradition, the Merkabah literature we touched on 2 ranks back, along with later Kabbalistic commentary building on it, takes this literalism seriously and pushes it further, describing the Ophanim not as decorated wheels, but as functioning sensory structures. A surface built entirely out of perception, a body whose only job is to detect. Sit with what that would actually mean, mechanically rather than poetically. A being with no blind spot in any direction at any moment, because its exterior is not skin over a nervous system. Its exterior is the nervous system. Whatever approaches it, from whatever angle, is seen before it arrives. That is not a guardian in the sense of a soldier standing watch. That is a guardian in the sense of a perimeter that cannot, structurally,
be caught off guard. It is worth noting, honestly, how consistently later artists refused to render this on the page. Art historians who study medieval illuminated manuscripts, books of hours, psalters, and devotional texts produced across the 11th through 15th centuries have traced a quiet, recurring substitution across dozens of surviving copies.
Where the text calls explicitly for a wheel covered in eyes, the image that actually appears is a plain gold ring, sometimes banded, sometimes jeweled, but bare of the one feature the passage insists on. Compare enough of these manuscripts side by side, and the pattern becomes hard to miss. Not an isolated artistic choice by one uncomfortable illustrator, but a habit repeated across scriptoria that had no contact with one another. The same substitution arrived at independently, generation after generation. You saw one version of this instinct already, back at the start of this video, in a scribe from the year 1340 who left an Ophanim's face blank rather than painted. This is the same avoidance, institutionalized. Not one nervous artist, a pattern spanning centuries across an entire tradition, all converging on the same solution. Replace the described thing with something abstract enough to be safe to look at.
There is a mundane version of this reflex you have almost certainly performed yourself without ever naming it. Think about the last time you scrolled past a medical diagram, a photograph from a crime report, an image your phone flagged before you tapped it. Most people do not linger. The eye skips, the thumb keeps moving, and some quiet internal editor decides the full image is not worth sitting with. Multiply that instinct across centuries of copyists working from the same source text, each one making a small, private decision not to render what the words plainly describe, and you get exactly what the manuscript record shows: a widening gap between what Ezekiel actually wrote down and what an ordinary worshiper ever ends up seeing on a page. That gap is not a curiosity. It is the entire reason the popular image of this hierarchy looks nothing like its source material.
Somewhere between the prophet's flat, repeated insistence on eyes round about, and the golden halo hanging over a saint's head in your average parish church, someone, then someone else, then someone else again, made the same editorial choice the scribe made in 1340, and it compounded for the better part of 1,000 years until the wheel disappeared entirely, and only the ring survived. But a sensory perimeter that never sleeps and detects everything raises the one question we still have not actually answered, the question this whole video keeps circling without landing on. Detecting for what? A guard rotation exists because there is something worth guarding against, or something worth keeping in, and the Ophanim's proximity to the throne itself means, whichever it is, it sits close enough to the center of this hierarchy that nothing has been allowed to describe it plainly in 2,500 years of surviving text. We are one rank away from an answer, and it is the strangest documented encounter in this entire hierarchy.
The gate to Eden did not stay unguarded for long. Genesis chapter 3 ends with the expulsion, the man and woman sent out of the garden, and the very next verse places a specific rank at the threshold behind them. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. That's the entire physical description the text gives us. No wings counted, no face described, no height, no color, no shape. Just a name, a position, and a weapon that turns on its own, guarding a single point of passage against re-entry. This is the cherubim. And before we go further, it's worth killing the image most of us are carrying around without realizing it.
The word has drifted, over centuries of religious art, into something closer to a plump infant with tiny wings, floating decoratively near a Renaissance ceiling. That image has nothing to do with the source material. Assyriologists working on Mesopotamian temple architecture have traced the likely root of the Hebrew word cherub back to an older term, kadibu, used across the region for a class of colossal guardian figures, winged, lion-bodied, human-faced statues stationed at palace and temple gateways specifically to intercept anything that should not be allowed to cross. These figures, sometimes called lamassu in the Akkadian record, stood at entry points the way a fortified checkpoint stands at a border, not as ornament, but as a stated line nothing was meant to cross uninspected. Stand in front of one of these figures today, and the description stops sounding like exaggeration. A handful of these Assyrian guardian statues survive largely intact, pulled from the ruined gate of Khorsabad, from Nimrud, from Nineveh, and now stand in museum halls in London and Paris, still faced outward the way they were carved to face, still positioned as if the gate they once flanked had simply been rebuilt around them centuries later. Some stand taller than two men. The body is a bull or a lion, the wings sweep back along a wall of stone, and the face, carved with open, deliberate eyes, bearded, human, expressionless, looks down at whoever passes beneath it without ever blinking, because stone does not blink. Assyrian court inscriptions describe these figures as apotropaic, built specifically to turn back demons, disease, and misfortune before any of it crossed the threshold into the palace or temple behind them. A modern visitor walking underneath one, dwarfed by tons of carved limestone with its gaze fixed forward and down, tends to go quiet without quite knowing why. That is the design working exactly as intended, thousands of years after the last king who commissioned one is gone. That is the lineage behind the being Genesis places at Eden's gate. Not a decoration guarding sentiment, a checkpoint guarding a boundary the text treats as absolute. And notice what it's guarding against, not intruders coming in. The passage is explicit that the danger runs the other way. Humanity, already exiled, is the thing being kept out, specifically kept from reaching the tree of life on the far side of that gate. The cherub's sword turned every way, covering every angle of approach, which tracks with everything we've seen so far about how this hierarchy escalates. No blind spot, no negotiation, a boundary enforced without exception. Here's the pattern completing itself now, the same one we caught with the Ophanim's wheel 2 ranks back. A being described in the source text with almost clinical restraint. A name, a function, a weapon, gets steadily reupholstered across centuries of art and retelling into something softer, cuter, easier to hang on a nursery wall. The wheel became a gold ring. The checkpoint guardian became a baby with wings. Different rank, same erosion, same direction every single time, toward comfort, away from what the page actually says. And that erosion is exactly what lets us finally close the question this video opened with, back at the River Chebar. The wheel Ezekiel saw is not a separate mystery sitting outside this hierarchy, waiting on some undiscovered explanation. Ezekiel chapter 10 already names it for us directly. The wheel is the Ophanim's own body, a sensory surface built without a blind spot, stationed in unbroken watch at the innermost position this hierarchy has. What it detects for, what it guards against, is the same thing every checkpoint rank in this structure guards against. Unshielded approach to something the text consistently declines to describe in full, across every author, every century, every tradition that has ever tried. That refusal is not withheld information being kept from you. It is the most consistent data point in the entire record. Every single person who got close enough to attempt a complete description, Ezekiel,
the scribe in 1340, the illuminators who swapped eyes for gold rings, stopped short of finishing the picture. Not because they lacked the skill, because something about finishing it felt like the wrong thing to do. Which brings us, finally, to the top of this hierarchy, and to the one encounter in this entire tradition where even the guardian rank itself will not look directly at what it serves.
Isaiah chapter 6 opens with the prophet standing, in vision, inside a throne room, and the being he sees stationed there is called by a different name than anything we've covered so far. Seraphim. The Hebrew root saraph means burning, the same root used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for the fiery serpents that afflict the Israelites in the wilderness during the Exodus narrative. A linguistic echo commentators have puzzled over for centuries without full resolution. Isaiah describes each seraph with 6 wings, and he is specific about what each pair does. 2 wings cover the face, 2 wings cover the feet. Only the 3rd pair is used for flight. The seraphim call to each other in a repeated cry, "Holy, holy, holy." And the sound alone is enough to shake the foundations of the thresholds and fill the house with smoke. Picture the physical space this vision is set inside, because Isaiah is specific about where he's standing. The text places the encounter in the year King Uzziah died, inside the Jerusalem temple, a stone structure where incense smoke already curled through the inner chamber as a matter of ordinary priestly routine, thick enough on some mornings that attendants working near the altar learned to breathe through cloth. Temple service ran in rotating shifts of priests and Levites, which means someone besides Isaiah was almost certainly present in the outer courts that day, going about an unremarkable task when the ground did something no ordinary morning had prepared them for. Isaiah says the foundations of the thresholds shook at the sound of the voice that cried. Not a metaphor for awe, a physical event, strong enough that anyone standing nearby, whether or not they were the one having the vision, would have felt solid stone shift underfoot. Ask any attendant serving that rotation what happened that morning, and the honest answer is probably that they grabbed the nearest door frame, kept their eyes on the floor, and did not look toward the inner sanctuary at all. Some instincts do not require training. They are simply older than the person having them. Sit with the detail Isaiah chose to include, because it is the single most important fact in this entire hierarchy, and it is easy to read past it. The highest-ranked being in this entire structure, standing in direct, unmediated proximity to the throne itself, still covers its own face. Not out of modesty, out of what every other rank below it has already demonstrated across this whole video. An encounter with what sits at the center of this system produces a response that even the most exalted rank in the record does not attempt to withstand directly. If the top of the hierarchy will not look, the fear gradient we've been tracking from the very first rank never actually resolves into safety at any point. It just changes shape. Isaiah's own reaction confirms it. "Woe is me," he says, "for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King." He does not celebrate the vision. He describes it as something closer to a diagnosis of his own unfitness to have witnessed it at all. A seraph responds, not with the tira formula we tracked earlier, but with something closer to a field intervention. It flies to him carrying a live coal, lifted from the altar with tongs rather than a hand, and touches it to his mouth, declaring his guilt purged and his sin taken away.
Even the mechanism of comfort escalates at this rank. Lower down the hierarchy, a spoken phrase was enough to steady a frightened human. Here, at the top, words are not sufficient.
It takes fire, applied directly, retrieved with a tool rather than touched bare-handed, even by the being administering it. That should tell you something about what actually sits above even this rank, close enough that a seraph needs tongs to handle what's near it safely. Every rank we have walked through so far raises the same unanswered question by the time you reach the top. If even the Seraphim cannot look directly at what they serve, why does a human being get to encounter any of this hierarchy at all, at any rank, without simply being destroyed by contact? The answer isn't hiding in Ezekiel or Isaiah or Enoch. It's in the work of the man who first sat down and tried to explain the whole system as a single, coherent piece of engineering. In the 6th century, a Christian writer working under the name Dionysius the Areopagite, borrowing the identity of a minor convert mentioned once in the Book of Acts, which is why modern scholarship refers to him as Pseudo-Dionysius, to distinguish the author from the historical figure he was writing as, composed a text called the Celestial Hierarchy. This is the document that formalized nearly everything we've covered across this video into the 9-rank, 3-sphere structure most people vaguely recognize today, even if they've never read a word of the original. But the part that gets dropped from nearly every summary of his work is his stated reason for building it this way. Dionysius does not describe the ranks as a ladder of merit, with better angels sitting closer to the divine as some kind of reward. He describes them as a graduated transmission system. Each rank, in his framing, receives illumination from the rank above it, and steps that illumination down before passing it further along, the way a series of channels might carry water from a source too forceful to approach directly, down to a basin a person can actually drink from without being knocked flat. His explicit stated purpose for the entire 9-rank structure is protective. Not to glorify the highest ranks, not to rank beings by holiness for its own sake, to keep whatever radiates from the center of the system from ever reaching a human mind at full, undiminished intensity. Read that against everything we've covered in this video, rank by rank, and the whole hierarchy reorganizes one more time, this time into its final shape. The Malakim delivering a message and vanishing, the Archangels executing judgment, the powers enforcing cosmic law, the dominions relaying instruction downward without altering it, the Ophanim standing in unbroken, all-seeing watch. The Cherubim holding a checkpoint no one is permitted to cross. The Seraphim, at the very top, still covering their own faces. None of that is a ranking of worthiness. It's a stack of transformers, each one stepping voltage down by exactly enough that the next rank in line can survive standing near it. All the way down, 9 ranks deep, until what reaches a human being on a hillside outside Bethlehem, or a prophet by a riverbank, is already a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the original signal. And it still drops grown men to the ground. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means the fear we traced across this entire hierarchy was never the system malfunctioning. It was the system working exactly as designed at every single rank, all the way down. Tira was never comfort layered on top of an accident. It was the last line of a protocol that started 9 steps higher, with a being who cannot look at its own source without covering its face first. There's a version of this same architecture running underneath a great deal of modern life, and once you notice it, it's difficult to unsee. Think about how a decision actually reaches you inside any large institution, a hospital system, a government agency, a corporation big enough to have its own legal department.
Somewhere at the top, a small group of people makes a call. That call does not travel to you directly. It passes through a vice president who translates it into policy language. The policy passes to a department head who converts it into a procedure. The procedure reaches a spokesperson who converts it again into a public statement, softened, generalized, stripped of whatever made the original decision sharp enough to cut. By the time it reaches you, a letter, an email, a customer service script read by someone who did not make the decision and cannot explain the reasoning behind it, you are encountering the 9th step down from a source you will never meet and were never designed to meet directly. The outer chamber exists precisely so you never have to. Most people experience that structure as bureaucracy, cold and impersonal by accident. Held up next to Dionysius's actual stated purpose for his 9 ranks, it starts to look less like negligence and more like design. Someone, somewhere, decided a human being should never receive certain decisions at full intensity, straight from the source, and built layers specifically to prevent it. That thought, honestly, is the part of researching this hierarchy that caught me most off guard, because I went in expecting to find superstition and came out finding something that looks a great deal like careful engineering.
Picture Dionysius himself, somewhere in a monastic cell or a scriptorium, not unlike the one we described earlier in this video, working through scripture, Enochic tradition, and centuries of prior commentary, trying to reconcile an obvious contradiction. Encounter after encounter shows fear as the dominant human response to these beings, and yet the beings are consistently described across every source as acting to prevent harm rather than cause it. Most compilers faced with that contradiction would have simply smoothed it over, picked the comforting reading, and left the fear out of the final draft. Exactly what we watched happen across 1,000 years of manuscript art earlier in this video. Dionysius did something closer to the opposite. He built an entire cosmological structure whose sole stated function is to explain why the fear is necessary, correct, and evidence of the system functioning rather than failing.
That is not the work of someone trying to make angels look impressive. That's the work of someone trying to protect the reader, trying to hand a terrified species a coherent reason why encountering the sacred nearly always hurts a little, without asking anyone to pretend it doesn't. There's something genuinely admirable in that, whether or not you take a single word of the underlying cosmology literally. A 6th century writer, working with fragments of older texts that mostly documented trauma without explaining it, chose to build a shield instead of a myth. 9 ranks deep, stepping intensity down floor by floor, so that whatever reaches the bottom is survivable. Later commentators, most notably Thomas Aquinas, writing his own systematic treatment of the angelic orders roughly 7 centuries afterward, inherited this same structure and treated it as settled doctrine, rarely questioning why Dionysius built it the way he did in the first place. Almost nobody, across all that commentary, stopped to ask what it means that the shield was ever necessary at all. What, precisely, a 9-layer containment system this carefully engineered was built to stand between us and. That is the question we still have not fully answered, and it is the one this video ends on. We climbed 9 ranks tonight, from a courier standing under a tree accepting roasted meat as an offering, to a being so far up the chain it needs tongs to touch its own altar coals. Along the way, we watched the exact same phrase, "Do not be afraid," repeat across centuries, languages, and authors who never read each other's work. And we found out it was never comfort. It was protocol. Damage control. Issued at the doorway of an encounter, every single rank in this hierarchy is built, from the ground up, to soften. So here is the awareness this video actually leaves you with, and I want to be direct about what it is not. It is not salvation.
It is not a technique, a prayer, or a practice that puts you outside the reach of any of this. Nobody watching this video gets to opt out of standing exactly where every human in every one of these texts already stood. Inside a structure built by something else, for reasons that structure never fully explains to the people living inside it. What you get, if any of tonight actually landed, is smaller than that and considerably more useful. You get to see the shield you were already standing behind. That's the whole offer. Not protection you didn't have 5 minutes ago. Recognition of protection that was already doing its job quietly the entire time, long before you knew to look for it. Picture where a piece of that failure still sits today, physically, behind glass in a manuscript collection in Paris or London. Somewhere in a climate-controlled case is the very folio type we described from 1340. A psalter, or a Book of Hours, vellum browned at the edges, gold leaf still catching light after 7 centuries. A visitor leans in, the way people do, expecting a saint's face, a haloed figure, something finished. What they get, on the right page, is the blank oval we already described. Never filled, never corrected, catalogued exactly as the scribe left it centuries ago. Because conservators do not complete another artist's abandoned work. Most visitors walk past without registering what they're looking at. A blank spot on old parchment reads as damage, as wear, as one more thing time did to a fragile object. It is not damage. It is the same decision repeating itself 700 years apart. A person standing close enough to something this hierarchy was built to shield them from, and choosing, quietly, not to finish looking. That is what recognizing the shield actually looks like in practice. Not a dramatic revelation. A blank space, still respected, centuries after the hand that left it blank is gone. Go back to where we started, because the ending of this video was hiding inside the opening the whole time. A priest on his face in the mud beside a river in Babylon, watching 4 living things move without turning, each one riding a wheel whose rim is packed edge to edge with eyes. We spent this entire video walking every rank standing between that image and the ordinary life you're living right now. And by the end, we learned what the wheel actually is. The Ophanim's own body, a perimeter with no blind spot, stationed at the innermost post this hierarchy has. Here's what's worth sitting with as we close. Ezekiel was not looking at the top of anything. He was looking at rank 8 of 9, one guard position removed from the center, and it still put a grown man face down in river mud, unable to form a complete sentence about what he'd just seen. That was the first rank humanity ever tried to fully describe on the page, and it was already more than the page could hold. Somewhere in that failure sits the real shape of the outer chamber structure we talked about last block, the modern one. The vice presidents and spokespeople and layers of translated policy standing between you and whatever decision actually got made somewhere you'll never be invited into. I'm not going to tell you that structure is a conspiracy, and I'm not going to tell you it's malicious. I'm going to leave it exactly where Dionysius left his 9 ranks, as a shield, built by someone for reasons that mostly get explained after the fact, if they get explained at all. You live behind version after version of that same architecture, ancient and modern both, whether or not anyone ever tells you it's there. You have almost certainly stood inside a smaller version of this same architecture without naming it. A hospital waiting room, a claims department, a government office with a number on a paper ticket in your hand. Somewhere behind that counter, a decision has already been made about your case. Approved, denied,
delayed, it does not matter which. And what reaches you is not that decision. It is a representative reading from a screen, repeating language written by someone in a department you will never visit, following a policy drafted by a committee you will never meet. All of it stepping down from a source that was never going to speak to you directly in the first place. Ask the person behind the counter why, specifically, and watch what happens. Most of the time they cannot tell you, not because they're hiding it, because the honest answer sits several layers above their own desk, translated and retranslated so many times by the time it reached them that the original reasoning is simply gone. You are not meeting the decision. You are meeting the last rank of some much smaller hierarchy, doing exactly what a last rank has always done in this video. Standing at the very end of a long chain of distance, holding a script it did not write, saying some version of the same 4 words in a language that no longer sounds like scripture at all. Here's the paradox this whole hierarchy leaves you holding, and I don't think it resolves cleanly, and I'm suspicious of anyone who tells you it does. The fear was never a sign the system was broken. The fear was the proof it was calibrated correctly. A graduated shield doing exactly what a shield does, one rank at a time, all the way down to a phrase gentle enough to say to a shepherd on a hillside. Which means the safest thing in this entire hierarchy is not the being that looks the most like us. It's the amount of distance standing between you and whatever the shield was built to step down in the first place. Comfort was never coming from the beings. It was coming from the layers. If this recalibrated how you read every angel story you thought you already knew, that's genuinely the whole point of sitting down and doing this properly, instead of taking the greeting card version at face value. So take the quiet second to like this video and subscribe so the next one lands in your feed instead of getting buried, because we are not finished with this shield. And before you go, the same ground rule we opened with, because it matters more at the end than it did at the start. Everything in this video comes from mythology, scripture, and centuries of esoteric commentary, not from established science, and not from any claim I'm making about what is literally true. Treat these texts as the record of what frightened and steadied our ancestors for thousands of years, worth taking seriously as exactly that, and nothing more certain than that. We spent this entire video on the ranks that held the line. We never got to the ones who broke it. The rank that looked at this same shield, the same protocol, the same 9 floors of graduated distance, and decided to cross down through it anyway. Next time, the Grigori, the Watchers, and the file the Book of Enoch keeps on all 200 names. Some doors stay shut for a reason. We're opening one next.